So far we have discussed a lot about terrestrial biomes, and here onwards, I'm going to talk about aquatic biomes. So first, let's take a look at where do you find water on the surface of Earth or anywhere within the biosphere? Where do you find water? We all know that if you look at the total global water budget, um, nearly 97% of that is in the ocean, in form of saline water, and about 2.5% of the Earth's entire water supply is fresh water. Now, if you break down that 2.5% of fresh water, you find that nearly 70% are trapped in glaciers and in ice caps, right? So now that is fresh water, but it's not in the liquid form, so not readily available for biological functions. And next, nearly slightly about 30% are actually groundwater. Although that's in liquid form, that's not either readily available for surface active organisms, for biota. That groundwater isn't available. So that leaves slightly above 1% as surface water that are in liquid form that are actually potentially available for a surface active organism. Now let's break down that 1.2% of the freshwater budget that is likely available for biota and see where you find them, right? So out of that, another nearly slightly less than 70% are actually does exist as permafrost or ground ice. Okay, so it's kind of near surface. It's not deep, right? Still, it's actually in frozen permafrost conditions. So nearly 70% of the surface freshwater again may not be readily available for biological organisms, or may not be available immediately for biological activities, or that permafrost may not be year-round available for organisms for their biological activities. And then another 20% are found in lakes. Another about 4% are as soil moisture. Another significant proportion or smaller proportion available in wetlands like swamps, marshes, about 0.5% available in rivers, uh, and again about 3% in low atmosphere, and again about 0.3% within living organisms. So that particular proportion that I circle over here with my pointer, what are the water available through lakes, rivers, wetlands, in the atmosphere, and within living organisms. Now, that are actually the most biologically available water, which sums up to something slightly over 30% of all the surface water available. Now, now that biologically available surface water, like that we just discussed, is actually slightly a small, very smaller fraction. We all know that 70% of Earth is covered with water, right? But largely that 70% belongs to oceans, right? So that's not fresh water. So biologically available freshwater supply is actually extremely scanty. Okay, it's actually not a very common resource. It's not readily available, as we just learned. Um, what is the importance of freshwater habitats. Why are we talking about freshwater biomes? Well, it's actually a connecting factor. It can, in terms of both physical and chemical means, freshwater habitats connect the land with ocean, and you know this through by simply by experience, simply by very basic knowledge. Rivers collects water from the lands, from groundwater, and bring that water through the land, through valleys, into the ocean, dumps it into the ocean. So by that way, it actually creates a physical and a chemical connection between the lands and the ocean. That kind of connection is extremely important for certain biological organisms. So certain fish we know that migrates from marine environments to deep to further inland freshwater environments through these physical connectors through rivers. And also um, the the rivers function as a pathway of bringing in chemical constituents from land to the ocean, helps the ocean to maintain ocean's chemical properties. The salinity, that high salinity that you observe in oceanic environments, are extremely important for the biological organism living in these oceans, right? So how do these rivers, how do these oceans get the salinity, the salts, the minerals, nutrients? That's actually from the rivers. um and also, the biological organisms living in freshwater biomes have evolved or have adapted to different types of flow dynamics, particularly in terms of rivers, and also have also responded to, through evolutionary time, seasonal changes in temperature. We do know that certain rivers can undergo freezing, can undergo near freezing conditions. Lakes undergo surface freezing, even Great Lakes do, right? And also greater changes in water chemistry. Changes in water chemistry is a lot pronounced in inland large aquatic environments, particularly even in certain larger freshwater lakes. Water chemistry can undergo fluctuations as rainfall brings in nutrients and salts through surface runoff. Turbidity is another very important parameter to which aquatic organisms respond to. About different types of freshwater biomes. First, stream communities. Um, So water flows in streams and rivers in response to gravity. That's why we do know by experience that streams originate in upland environments, in mountains, and then flows through valleys gradually towards the ocean, towards the coastal plain. So it's flowing from mountains to lowlands. So there you go. Water flows in response to gravity. Simple knowledge. And water flow in these streams can greatly shape Earth's geomorphology through the processes of differential erosion as well as deposition. In fact, there are certain arguments that, or other geological theories and hypotheses, which explains the current heavily dissected geomorphology and geography of southwestern United States is actually a response to historical geological variation in river flow conditions. And flowing water is known as a lotic water or lotic systems in ecology. Now, communities occupying stream habitats are influenced by a variety of parameters. So, stream size, okay, you can also consider that as stream width, flow velocity or variation in the stream flow speed, um, and different types of habitats created within a given stream channel, within a given river as it flows from mountains all the way to the ocean. A concept of stream order, which we will actually talk about later on. Stream mode actually refers to a variation of the stream size. In fact, as a river flows from the mountains or from the headwaters towards the ocean. So, smallest size of streams with the smallest size are considered the first order streams. So those smallest streams are found at the origin of a particular river. Okay, and we are looking at mountains, headwaters in other terms. So the largest size of largest sized rivers are found at the coastal environments where the river meets the ocean. Okay, and those streams are known as high order streams. So higher the order of a stream, the size of the stream or the width of the stream is also larger, and the volume of water it carries is also greater. Just to get an idea about the variation, possible stream order variation, let's take a couple of examples of the well-known largest rivers in the world. In North America, as all of you know, the largest river is River Mississippi. I think it's about 9 or 10th in terms of the highest order when Mississippi meets the ocean. Nile, the largest river in the world, I think the order is about largest order is about 12. Variety of stream habitats you can find in a given stream channel, and here I'm going to very highly generalize um, and talk about two different habitat types in any given stream in any continent in any part of the world: ripples or riffles and pools. Now, riffles have fast flowing water. Water moves faster in the riffle habitats. And why? Because in riffle habitats, you are looking at a lower volume of water flowing over coarse stream bed material like boulders and rocks and large pebbles. So since water is moving faster over a coarse substrate, it creates a turbulent flow, right? And the turbulent flow increases mixing of oxygen or air with water. So the dissolved oxygen concentration in ripples or in riffle environments of a river is extremely high. The next type is pools, as the word itself means. Pools have relatively still water. Water flow is slower, and water is flowing over a much finer sediments, and therefore you don't see the turbulence when water of a river flows through a pool habitat. And pools also generally tends to be much deeper than a ripple habitat. So those are the very basic differences that I wanted you to know between pools and ripple habitats in a stream. And as you can see in the upper image, upper drawing diagram, in generally you see alternating patterns of pools and riffles as a stream flows from mountains towards the coastal plain. This image shows actually a characteristic stream riffle, right, where you can see faster flow of water flowing over these large boulders, which makes up the substrate of the stream. Um, and over here in this part of this river, you can see water flowing very slowly and apparently in a very deep water environment. And that is actually a characteristic pool habitat, right? And if you look slightly to this part of that image, right? Now there you can see some turbulence in the surface, right? So you know this part of the river is actually a ripple. And over here in this image, you are seeing a very slow, near still flow of water. So then you know that part is actually definitely a pool habitat. So let's talk a little bit more about different types of habitat zones that you can find in a stream system. In the image, you can see three different types of zones that you can find within a stream. So here, this portion where you have the standing water is called the main channel, okay? And then the bottom of the stream habitat, right over here, as I show with my laser pointer, is the benthic zone, right? And then this area that is beyond the benthic zone is known as the hypohaic zone. Let me describe these three zones a little bit more and talk about what kind of organisms you find in each and every zone within a stream. So main channel, right, is where you find most of the organisms that can swim, like fish, right? Benthic zone is where you find bottom dwelling organisms, and many of them are going to be invertebrates. As so most vertebrates occur in the main channel. Most of the invertebrates in a river system are found within the benthic zone, or the bottom zone of a river. And what do these benthic invertebrates do? They are also known as benthos, kind of a scientific term. So those benthos feed on detritus, meaning the dead organic matter that accumulates into the river channel. And also some of the benthos are also predators. Crayfish could be a good example, and not to mention that certain crayfish also feed on detritus. Most of the aquatic insect larvae can be considered as detritus feeding organisms. Now to the hyperhaic zone, this the zone that's found beneath or beyond the benthic zone. Now hyperhaic zone is the substrate immediately below and adjacent to the stream that actually creates an interacting zone between the main channel and the groundwater habitats. So groundwater movement happens through the hyperhaic zone. So hyperhaic zone allows bidirectional movement of water. So that zone is extremely important for the stream channel to keep its communication, keep its ecological links with groundwater habitats. And not to mention that hyperhaic zone also has its own unique assemblage of fauna and flora, particularly fauna in terms of there are unique types of invertebrates you find in that particular area. The another kind of a fourth zone that is not actually marked in this image, I'm showing kind of a particular area immediately adjacent to the main channel on the land is known as the riparian zone. It's the terrestrial or the upland environment immediately around the main channel where you see growth of vegetation, right? So those are the four major parts or zones of a particular stream habitat. So now we are going to talk about organisms living in lakes and different zones of a lake. So lakes where you have relatively still water are known as lentic habitats. Rivers were known as lotic habitats. Lakes are known as lentic habitats. Um, Lakes are of both natural and anthropogenic origin, as you already know. And what are the natural processes that creates lakes, that generates lakes? Well, glacial flow, glacial processes. Meaning, as you saw in the top images, um, snow caps and glacial accumulations on top of the mountains will move downwards. How? Why? Well, the gravity pulls things down. And also, as snow accumulates over and over and over, it becomes so heavy, the entire all the snow and ice accumulating at the top of the mountain will start slowly descending down along the slope. As it as these glaciers or ice caps started moving down, it actually kind of caves in into the soil, into the earth, as you see in these images, and kind of digs into the soil and creates earthen depressions, right? And these kind of glacial processes, needless to say, are only found in the temperate and polar regions, because it's only in temperate and polar environments you get snow accumulation, ice accumulation, and thus glacial formation is only limited to temperate and polar environments, never in tropical areas. So what happens here, as the glacials moves down a mountain, as it caves into the soil, digs into the earth, it creates a depression, right? And subsequently, the ice melts and fills in the depression and makes a beautiful lake, like you see in this image over here. And you can clearly see it's surrounded by mountains, and those mountains still has remarkable extent of snow and ice on them. Another type uh, of natural lakes are known as oxbow lakes. So that image over here, you see an oxbow lake. What happens here is actually, these oxbow lakes are historically parts of rivers. As rivers meander, and through the surface of the earth, the the river channel changes its pathway, and sometimes certain segments of the river channel becomes pinched off from the main channel and become isolated from the main channel, and subsequently becomes an isolated aquatic habitat and thus becomes a lake. um, and also other geological phenomena like eruption of a volcano could lead to formation of lakes called craters. As you see over here, you can kind of see the shape of that lake is nearly a circle, and it's actually located on the top of a volcano. After the volcano erupts, there is a depression created on the top of the volcano, which subsequently get filled with rainwater or melting ice or snow, and ultimately creating a lake. Aside from that, there are many other geological phenomena like movements or subsidence of tectonic plates that actually creates lakes. Formation of sinkholes can create lakes. And also, there are animals that through their natural behavior that creates um, lakes. Beavers are a good example, who are well known to engineer a dam across a flowing river and creates a deep still water habitat that almost entirely change the biological community living in that aquatic habitat, as you see over here. Look how tall the dam is constructed by a beaver. And by the way, this dam is constructed by a single beaver over a shorter period of time. And you can also argue humans are also animals, so those reservoirs um, they construct, can be argued in one way or the other as somewhat natural. But we all know that how much artificial alterations, manipulations go into formation of a reservoir. So, well, maybe not so much natural in that case. So communities in these lentic habitats are influenced by the depth, right? Depth of water, right? Um, so certain lakes are shallow, right? Certain oxbow lakes, for example, could be extremely shallow, right? Glacial lakes are known to be quite deep, for example. So variation of the deep influences light penetration, okay? Shallower lakes may actually have light penetration all the way up to the bottom, whereas certain deep lakes, light penetration may be limited to a first few feet. So when light penetration is impaired, photosynthesis is impaired. So which is actually a major form of energy generation in still in lentic habitats. So water depth and light penetration are extremely important to shape the biological community in lake habitats. Let me explain how biological communities in lakes are shaped by water depth and the extent of solar radiation penetration. Um, in generally, deep lakes with a much smaller surface area tends to be nutrient poor, right? In contrast, shallower lakes with a larger surface area tends to be nutrition rich. The reason is deep lakes with smaller surface area may have a greater volume of water, depending on the depth. And also because the surface area of the lake is small, that particular lake may not intercept a greater extent of surface runoff after precipitation. So the supply of nutrient to that kind of a lake is going to be lower, and if the water volume is greater in that kind of a lake, the nutrient is going to get diluted. Hence, ultimately, you're going to have a nutrition deficient or nutrient poor lake. Um, in contrast, shallower lakes with a larger surface area may have a lower volume of water, so even a smaller amount of nutrient supply can increase the entire nutrient content in that lake and make that lake nutrient rich. Also, I need to mention here that if the surface area of the lake is greater, that lake may intercept a greater volume of surface runoff and therefore retains a greater amount of a nutrient through surface runoff and ultimately become quite rich in nutrient content in the lake. What are the different zones um, of a lake? So first, pelagic zone. Where is that? Pelagic zone is actually the entire open water habitat, right? So pelagic zone is actually the open water habitat, as I show you over here in with my laser pointer, right? And so since that's actually an open water environment with ample exposure to solar radiation, there's a lot of plankton, which dominates the biological community, right? And you know what planktons are. Those are microscopic organisms that are suspended in water. And so what kind of planktons are we talking about here? Well, most of them are going to be phytoplankton, which are photosynthetic, meaning they can actually synthesize complex organic food from solar radiation. Um, so they can only occupy the top layer of water through which light completely penetrates, right? Um, so therefore, that the zone in which you find phytoplankton are known as the photic zones, meaning the zone with ample exposure to sunlight, right? And it's also known as euphotic zone, as you can see in this image, as I pointed out with my laser pointer. Another kind of plankton is zooplankton, kind of meaning animal plankton. Um, those are non-photosynthetic protists and other tiny animals that can also live largely in the euphotic zone that essentially feeds on phytoplankton. And then we will move into this littoral zone, right? That's actually the near shore shallow water environment. And in the littoral zone, the water depths are quite shallow. So therefore, the light completely penetrates all the way to the bottom in the littoral zone. So because of that, there are lots of macrophytes or rooted larger vegetation, right? Occurring throughout the littoral zone. And then we come to the benthic zone. Not to, I should mention over here, we found a benthic zone in the stream beds as well, and so we have a benthic zone over here. In the benthic zone, which is actually kind of the bottommost environment of a lake, you find lots of accumulation of decaying organic matter that comes from both littoral and pelagic zone. So, which also provide energy or food to different types of benthic fauna which actually mostly comprised of invertebrates, fungi, which actually are largely fungi, as you know, are decomposers, and bacteria that are also decomposers, right? And the benthic environment of a lake could be quite cold, could be lower in temperature, and maybe poor in dissolved oxygen because it's way deep down in water in a lake. That particular benthic water doesn't have much chance to mix with the surface water, and also way down deep over here, right, there is no photosynthetic organism to release oxygen, so oxygen conditions over benthic zone can be quite lower. And not to mention that the detritus accumulate in the benthic zone consumes whatever the little oxygen available over there. And also the only source of oxygen for the benthic zone is diffusion from the euphotic zone. Okay, now let's take a look at different type of marine environments and marine communities. So first, the nearshore environment, which are the marine zones found immediately next to continents, which are heavily influenced by the local continental climate, um, the tidal actions, wave actions, and also inputs or influxes from fresh water through rivers in forms of riverine flow as well as in forms of sediment flux. We should talk a little bit about the tides and tidal actions, which you might be quite familiar with, living in a coastal area. So, in this situation, we know that the ocean water or the oceanic water moves, towards and away from the coast in response to the gravitational attraction of the moon. So because of that, because of the tidal actions, certain parts of the coasts can be inundated in a particular part of the day and completely exposed in another part of the day. And this tidal cycle is a recurrent daily pattern that greatly influences the biological organisms living there. Um, because of the tidal actions, actually, with tide moving in and out of the coastal areas, it kind of creates a transitional zone between the land, the terrestrial environment, and the deep marine environment. So in this transitional zone from high tide to low tide, um, you are going to see a salinity gradient, a salinity variation, and also duration of the inundation, meaning how long a particular part of the tidal zone remains underwater given in a given day, and also with the movement, bidirectional movement of water into the tidal zones, the nutrient supply also varies. Another form of a coastal environment are estuaries. So estuaries, by definition, are these unique environments, kind of a transitional environment where river flows into the oceans. Um, so estuaries receive water from different sources. One, through the fresh water, is received through the river flow, and then the tidal actions brings in salt water, oceanic water. So what does river water or the river flow brings into the estuary? Well, it brings in fresh water, um, sediments, substrates, nutrients, energy in forms of dead organic matter, also brings in certain suspended organisms, right? And salinity in an estuary varies significantly given the degree extent to which how fresh water from the river mixes with the oceanic or salt water coming through tidal actions. So the salinity variation could be observed in an estuary at a daily basis, at a seasonal basis, also at an annual basis. So there's a greater variation of salt concentration in estuaries. And needless to say, during drought seasons, the freshwater flow to an estuary is going to go down. As a result, the salinity of an estuary can increase. During the flood season, on the other hand, rivers start to bring so much fresh water into an estuary, diluting the salts and thus decreasing the salinity. Now, with this kind of since estuaries receive nutrients and sediments and water from both ocean and freshwater environments, um, let me correct the last sentence. I might have made a slight blunder. When since estuaries receive water from both rivers as well as from the oceans, receive so much nutrients from both of those sources. Therefore, the productivity is extremely high. There's ample amount of nourishment and energy available for a variety of organisms to occupy those habitats. Therefore, estuaries in general, um, no matter where they are found, could be extremely productive. And also, estuaries are also known to be very good nurseries for development of juveniles for eggs to hatch. And also, for many commercially valued fish species, their larval stages, their juvenile stages, early growth stages are spent in estuaries, probably due to two main reasons. One being estuaries are quite safer environments from predators. Why? Well, I mentioned earlier estuaries undergo greater salinity fluctuation. So because of the salinity variation, kind of creates a greater environmental pressure. So not many large species can occupy that stressful environment, which makes it a safe environment for juvenile or younger life history stages to grow. And also juveniles require a lot of nutrient. Okay, and I just mentioned that estuaries are quite productive, high in nutritional and caloric value, so probably has a lot of resources over there for a growing juvenile. um and also, other than fish, there are lots of other mollusks, shellfish, and many invertebrates that could be either residential species of estuaries or a transient species in estuaries. So another type of coastal biome are salt marshes. So salt marshes by definition are shallow coastal wetlands located in the coastal zone that are largely dominated by vegetation like grasses, rushes, and herbs. Um, so how do salt marshes become created? Well, it's kind of a result of river flow. When rivers flow towards the ocean, it carries so much sediment and substrate silt. As river flow slows down, as rivers approach the coast, the suspended material, the sediments, silt, sand, and other kind of substrate, including organic matter, settles down and gets deposited, and subsequently it recruits other forms of vegetation and other communities and becomes a salt marsh. And you see a couple of images of salt marshes. And since salt marshes are connected to or are linked with rivers, salt marshes receive ample amount of nutrition, right? And that also makes salt marshes extremely productive habitats. um, And also, well, salt marshes are located in the coastal area, and we also know coastal areas or coastal biomes are influenced by the tidal activity. Tidal activity too actually produces a salinity gradient, which we mentioned a few slides back. So, since there's a salinity gradient, okay, since there is a salinity gradient uh, in salt marsh from oceanic environment all the way to the inland, you will see a zonation of the plant assemblages. So what kind of a plant assemblage are we talking about? What kind of a salinity gradient are we talking about? Where do you have to find the highest salinity in a salt marsh? Where do you find the lowest salinity? So highest salinity, surprisingly, the highest salinity in a salt marsh is found at the highest ground point, meaning highest salinity could be found um, furthest away from the ocean. Okay, so how so? Okay, if the high tide area or the high marsh area is the furthest away from the ocean, how come that area has so much salinity? Well, um, that area, well, does receive through tidal actions. High marsh does receive salt water, right? And it immediately gets evaporated, right? But the tidal action don't necessarily reach high marsh all the time. So whatever the salt that accumulates in the high marsh doesn't get necessarily flushed out with the tidal currents. So um, as high tide approaches the high marsh, as the high tide recedes, or as the water evaporates from the high tide, salts accumulate in the soil and doesn't get flushed out necessarily. In the low tide environment, right, although low tide environments are in constant contact with salt water, the salt that accumulates in that environment get frequently flushed because low tide reaches the lower marsh much more frequently. So because of that, you will actually see a plant gradient. In the high marsh, you have certain plants that are highly adapted to higher levels of salinity, and towards the lower marsh, you get certain plants that are less tolerant of high salinity. It's kind of a very interesting gradient to talk about. By definition, are a unique type of evergreen trees and shrubs that are tolerant of salt water that are growing largely in shallow water estuaries found in tropical and subtropical coasts. Florida is a good example. Most of the tropical islands also have a good cover of mangroves throughout their coastal areas. Um, the mangroves actually have a very unique root system. As you can see in the image, it has a very dense, large root system that traps sediments, traps organic matter flowing from the land towards the ocean, and kind of builds up and develops a shoreline. Essentially, mangroves stabilizes shoreline, kind of prevents coastal erosion, and in fact, with the ability to trap sediment from the land, mangroves creates land and also purifies coastal water. And and also mediates supply of nourishment, nutrient to the marine environments. And with that complex structure of the three-dimensional root structure that you find within mangroves habitats, it creates a perfect environment for a variety of marine and coastal and aquatic as well as semi-aquatic animals, as well as different other types of organisms. Um, I can list on mentioning several examples. I'm showing two unique species. One is this crab-eating monkey. Those monkeys, those primates actually dive into water simply in search of crabs, and they can remain underwater for quite a long time too. And also there's fishing cats, a carnivore that is really good at diving and catching fish in these coastal environments. And then monitor lizards that are largely terrestrial, but we've found, as a herpetologist, as someone who research on these animals, I have found very stable populations of monitor lizards in mangrove environments, particularly, not surprisingly, because of the diverse amount extent of prey available in mangrove biomes. Reefs are one of the most diverse, most productive biomes in the world. Not just most productive, most diverse aquatic biomes. No, coral reefs, in terms of diversity and productivity, are comparable to tropical rainforests. Um, so where do you find coral reefs? They are mostly restricted to warm, shallow, tropical and subtropical waters. You know by now, with your knowledge from Biology 122, that coral reefs are not just one organism. It's actually made out of two organisms. Primarily it is cnidarians, forming large colonial forms. And these cnidarians um, develop a symbiotic mutualism with an algal partner and makes up these extremely diverse coral reefs. And in that image, you're actually seeing a close-up of the cnidarians. And so what do coral reefs do? Well, they actually extract calcium carbonate from seawater and builds up a three-dimensional skeleton-like structure. That's what you call as a coral reef. And because of the overall three-dimensional complexity of the reefs, it does support and recruits millions of other marine species, and thus becomes one of the most diverse habitats. And there are a variety of economically important fish, at least spending a part of their life cycle in coral reefs. Famous pair share moments. Well, here we are actually not, in the same room, literally speaking. So I'm going to explain you the situation here. So you're supposed to select the correct statement about aquatic biomes, and if I were you, I would hit the post button and select the correct answer myself. But I'm going to explain it to you. So the first option, in lakes and ponds, photosynthesis occurs primarily in the benthic zone. We know that's not true because in lakes and ponds, photosynthesis is limited to the surface zone, the euphotic zone, and the littoral zone. Right in the benthic zone, it's too deep, too cold, um, and too deep for sunlight to penetrate, and hence photosynthesis is unlikely to occur in the benthic zone. So option A is wrong. Option B, glacial movements and volcanic activities can lead to formation of lakes. We know that statement is correct because those two are actually one of the main geological phenomena that lead to formation of lakes, particularly in the temperate environments. Option C, depth can greatly influence the biological communities in lakes. That is also true because as the deeper you go into a lake, right, it'll be colder, it will also be darker, right? There will be less sunlight penetration, and it could be also oxygen poor. So based on these three physicochemical parameters, certainly biological communities can change in a lake as you dive deeper. So option C is also correct. D, higher order streams are found in mountains while low order streams are found in coastal areas. That is incorrect. It's actually the other way around. Higher order streams are found in coastal areas while low order streams are found in mountains. Option E, most coastal aquatic biomes are very low in productivity and diversity. We know that is greatly incorrect. We are aware of many coastal aquatic biomes like estuaries, tidal flats, Um, Coral reefs and several other coastal biomes are quite rich in diversity and extremely productive simply because of greater supply of nutrients. So option E is incorrect, D is incorrect, A is incorrect, leaving B and C to be the correct answers here. Well, here I'm not going to give you the answer. I mean, based on your general knowledge, you should be able to tackle this one for yourself and maybe do some research yourself if you cannot find an answer from your general knowledge. But it's important either way that you do it. Okay, guys, this is the end of the podcast, and we will continue the lecture in the class.